Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thanks for making the time to be here. It's an honor to be at the University of Michigan. As a Michigander, I am very grateful for the intellectual legacy and work of this place. It is in many ways an international beacon of rigorous pursuit of an understanding of our world. So I'm glad to contribute to that. I did not get the same memo that Austin did about the tie, so I apologize in advance for that. But if I really want to sort of get to know you, if I really want to understand who you are and what makes you tick, I'm not going to ask, what do you know? There's a million things that you know that don't tell me anything about who you really are. I'm not even going to ask just what do you believe? Because again, there are all kinds of things that you believe that don't really necessarily touch the very core of who you are. And that's because you're not just a thinking thing. You're not just a brain on a stick. Your thoughts don't really disclose and animate and orient you. No, if I really want to sort of peer into who you are and understand what makes you tick, here's the question I want to ask you. What do you want? What do you want? What are your wants, your desires, your hungers, your cravings, your longings? What are your loves? Because that is the real animating center of your identity. In a sense, every Instagram post where you said #want tells me more about you than the petitions that you've signed, and certainly more about you probably than the term papers that you've written. As that great theologian Bruce Springsteen once put it, everybody's got a hungry heart. And in a way, that's what I want to meditate on tonight and think with you about and try to unpack philosophically. What does it mean that everybody's got a hungry heart? And that hungry heart is actually the engine that drives you. So here, in fact, is the really discomforting reality I want us to run up against. What if I don't know what I want? What if I don't love what I think? This sort of discomforting epiphany hit home for me when I was watching a film by the Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky called I Need Better Hobbies, granted. But I don't know if any of you are Tarkovsky fans. Some of you might know other films, Andrei Rublev. Tarkovsky has this kind of neglected film called Stalker. And it's such a powerful articulation of our question tonight that I want to try to rehearse it with you just briefly. I'm not going to assume that you've seen it. You have to imagine this film is, it's kind of half Cormac McCarthy's The Road, and the other half is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, okay? So it's this weird blend of sort of sci-fi, noir, thriller, but set in an entirely post-apocalyptic wasteland that has been destroyed by some kind of catastrophe, we know not what. And into this world, we step and meet three key characters. That's why it's so easy to get this film. The three key characters are the writer, the professor, hence I was a sucker for this movie, the writer, the professor, and then this guy called the stalker, which is not as creepy as it sounds, because really the stalker is something like the guide, if you will. Okay? And the first part of this film is us following writer and professor on this arduous journey with the stalker who is leading them through this post-apocalyptic wasteland that's, imagine just this kind of bombed out, dark, black and white world, but they are trying to get someplace, and the place they're trying to get to is called the zone. And really what they want to do is, and picture the zone now as this like bright, colorful, lush oasis of hope. And then where they're really trying to get to is something like the inner sanctum, the almost kind of holy of holies within the zone that is simply called the room. Right? Tarkovsky, not super descriptive or creative with the titles. Writer, professor with stalker, trying to make their way to this room. Why? What's in the room? In this room, he tells them, they will achieve their heart's desires. When you get to the room, all your dreams will come true. In the room, you get exactly what you want. Which is why then, when they're on the very threshold of the room, professor and writer, interestingly, start to get cold feet. And one of our great essayists and critics of today, Jeff Dyer, you might see him in the New York Review of Books, he wrote a brilliant little book about this movie. The book is called Zona, and I want you to just hear his description of this key moment in the film because he captures it perfectly. They are in a big, dark, derelict, abandoned, damp room with what looked like the remains of an enormous chemistry set floating in the puddle in the middle, as if the zone resulted from an ill-conceived experiment that went horribly wrong. Off to the right, through a large hole in the wall, is a source of light that they all look towards. For a long while, no one speaks. The air is full of the chirpy, chirpy, cheep, cheep of bird song. It's the opposite of those places where the sedge has withered from the lake and no birds sing. Here, the birds are whistling and chirruping and singing like mad. And so Stalker tells writer and professor, in a way he tells us, that we are now on the very threshold of the room. This is the most important moment in your life, he says. Your innermost wish will be made true here. So it's like Stalker has led them to the threshold of this room. This is why we've been on this journey. This is why we've made this arduous pilgrimage. They get to the place that they've been longing for. Right, Stalker opens the door and basically says, who wants to go first? And writer and professor basically do one of these numbers. They both get cold feet. Why? Isn't this why we're here? Isn't this everything you've been hoping for? Who doesn't want to step into the room where you're going to get exactly what you want? It dawns on them. What if I don't know what I want? Well, says Dyer, that's for the room to decide. The room reveals all. What you get when you step into that room, what you get is not what you think you want, but what you really wish for, what you most deeply wish for. And so now this disturbing epiphany is creeping up on writer and professor. What if they don't want what they think? What if the desires that they are conscious of, the ones in a sense that they've kind of consciously chosen, what if those actually aren't their innermost, deepest longings? What if in some sense their deepest longings are humming under their consciousness unawares? What if in effect they are not who they think they are? Well, how could that happen? What would make that plausible? How could it be that I don't know what I want? How could there be this gap and this disconnect between my conscious perception of myself and actually what I'm hungering and thirsting and craving for? Well, this is where I want to dive in tonight and try to explore why we might experience this tension and gap in our lives. And all of it revolves around an ancient philosophical notion of habit. So think of it this way. Imagine your loves, your longings, your hungers, your wants. I'm going to use all those terms synonymously, right? Your desires and your cravings. Imagine that your loves, like that, are habits, right? That your loves are habits. What's the significance of describing them as habits? Well, it's not, when we say habit here, we don't mean just these exterior routines that you go through. We tend to use the word habit for the kind of exterior rituals that we go through. So you might say, I have a habit of always putting on my left sock first, or so, which turns out to be true. But well, that's the routine. That's the ritual. That's actually not the habit in this sense. When we talk about habits, this is true, by the way, both in philosophy, and it's an ancient tradition in philosophy. Interestingly, we're going to see it's also the way to think about habit in contemporary social psychology, positive psychology, and even some accounts of cognitive science and neuroscience. Habit here is not just the exterior ritual and routine that you're going through. It is an acquired disposition. It's a kind of default orientation that you have learned and acquired that has become woven into the fabric of your character, so that now a habit, something that is habitual, something that has become habit, is precisely the kind of thing that you do without thinking about it. Does that make sense? So that something that is habitual is something that has become automated for you in a sense. It's something that has become, and this is the way Aristotle talked about it 2,000 years ago. He said a habit is something that has become for you second nature. We use that phrase, right? Sometimes you say, oh, that's second nature for her, which means what? She couldn't not do that. That's the kind of person she is. Like that, it's so built into the fabric of who she is that she couldn't not be that way. It's second nature. Now, why call it second nature? Well, because in a sense it mimics first nature. What's first nature? First nature is biology, right? So think of first nature. Biology are all the kinds of systems and aspects of who we are that are humming along, operating without our thinking about it, so that we can sort of live and move and make our way in the world. So for example, all of us have been in here tonight successfully breathing without thinking, as far as I can tell, without thinking about it, right? I mean, now you're thinking about it, but you weren't thinking about it before. So what does that mean? Well, in a sense, nature, these biological dispositions that are wired into you, are taking care of a system so that you don't have to consciously, it's not like we've all been sitting here saying, inhale, exhale, right? You haven't been choosing to breathe. You don't have to be conscious and deliberate about it because it's taken care of by nature. Okay, if you get that, now what we're calling habits are like that in the sense that they are ways of being in the world, they are ways of being oriented to the world, there are ways of acting that become defaults for you so that you are that way in the same way without thinking about it. You don't have to choose, you're not deliberating about it. The difference between first nature, biology, and second nature, these other habits, is that they are acquired and learned over time. They're not instinctual and built into the hard wiring of our biological systems, okay? How are we doing, all right? So, the first piece of the puzzle here is to realize that our loves, our longings, our desires, our cravings are much more like habits than they are like choices. Or at least on some significant register, our hungers and our longings and our cravings are a kind of heart habit, a disposition of who we are that is learned and acquired, and then becomes so woven into the fabric of our character that we become the kinds of people who act in this direction or pursue those ends, those things that we want, without thinking about it. It's automated. In fact, this is where the social psychology piece is a really interesting kind of contemporary confirmation of ancient philosophical intuitions here. Because people like John Bargh or Roy Baumeister will emphasize that, in a way, human consciousness is like this iceberg. And the tip of the iceberg is sort of what you think about and deliberate about and choose every day. And I think it's Baumeister who suggests that really, probably in a given day, about 5 to 7% of what you do is the outcome of conscious, deliberate choice. So now think of what's going on under the iceberg, under the tip of the iceberg. What that means is over about 90% of what you do in a given day are actions you undertake without thinking about them. Why? Because they have become automated dispositions and behaviors that have become so woven into the fabric of who you are that now you do it without thinking about it. And in fact, so overwhelmingly, the majority of how we live, how we act, what we pursue, what we're chasing, bubbles up from these habituated dispositions that we've acquired, much, much more than us consciously thinking through and deliberating and making choices. So if you can start to appreciate the significance of that, you'll start to realize, oh, wait a second. My life, my living, my being in the world is governed in significant ways by habits that I have acquired, by these dispositions that have become woven into me that I have learned, and of which I am not thinking, and in fact, in many ways, I am not conscious. Now that would be bad enough, but I want to add one more layer. Not bad enough. That is significant enough. I want to add one more layer of significance, which is this. It's not only that your habitual dispositions are unconscious and not something that you are deliberating about and thinking about. Here's the kicker. The process of habituation, that is, the process by which these habits are being inscribed into you, is also often unconscious. Do you see what I mean? In other words, we are all learning, we are all acquiring, we're all being sort of immersed in rhythms and routines and practices that are subtly and covertly and unconsciously training our heart habits, our longings, our desires and cravings, and all of it is happening under the radar of our awareness. So how could it be that I could get to the threshold of the room and I think, oh, well, this is the place where I'm going to finally get exactly what I want? Why would it be that I could come to this place and realize, what if I don't want what I think? Well, because what if you've already all of a sudden had this realization that maybe there has been a formation of my dispositions of hungering and thirsting and longing that have been forming me and I didn't even realize it. That I've been learning to love and want things and ways because I've actually been immersed in rhythms and rituals and routines that have been training my heart habits without my awareness. It's exactly why we need to be careful what we devote ourselves to. So if Dylan puts it this way, if Springsteen says everybody's got a hungry heart, then you have to couple that. I'm all of a sudden realizing I sound very old because I'm quoting Springsteen and Dylan, when it should be Kanye and Chance the Rapper. So I could probably do this. Just give me my guys, okay? Dad rock. So if Springsteen rightly emphasizes that everybody's got a hungry heart, I want to couple this now with Dylan's insight that you got to serve somebody. Everybody's going to serve somebody. To say that we are lovers, to say that we are these desiring creatures who hunger and thirst and crave and long, is really just another way of saying that to be human is to be the kind of creatures who give ourselves over to something. It's just part of being human. We are the kinds of beings who give ourselves over to something. The novelist and writer David Foster Wallace got at this so presciently in a famous Kenyon College commencement address, in which he simply put it this way. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, he said, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing, now listen why, because there is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships, he said. The only choice you get is what to worship. Everybody's going to serve somebody. Now, the habits of our heart then, what you love is what you worship, is the way to put this together. And in that sense, the habits of our hearts are shaped and aimed and acquired through the rituals and rhythms and routines that we now give ourselves over to. So even if you don't think of yourself as religious, I get that. That doesn't mean that you're not devoting yourself to something. And what you devote yourself to isn't just something that you do, it's doing something to you. That's where the formation piece comes in that we often don't realize. What you devote yourself to isn't just something that you do, it's doing something to you. And so I want to call those kinds of loaded, heart-shaping, habit-forming, love-directing practices, I'm going to call those, it sounds like a churchy word, but I want to call them liturgies, just to get at the kind of religious nature of these sorts of cultural practices that are shaping the habits of our hearts. Now, these liturgies, granted, won't look religious in the typical sense. Rather, they'll look every day, and they'll even seem kind of ho-hum. But what I'm suggesting is, if you don't see them as these formative practices that they are, you'll miss the fact that they carry within them a story, a narrative about what the good life looks like, about what I should be chasing. So they're working on us unconsciously under the radar. Think of it this way. Look, nobody becomes a consumerist, right? And let's say, for our purposes, let's just say tonight, consumerism would be a way of life that is devoted to the promise that stuff will make you ultimately happy, okay? Nobody becomes a consumerist because somebody comes and meets them with an argument that convinces them that consumerism is true. If I just, when I just said that right now, that stuff will make you happy, you're like, that's ridiculous. Doesn't mean that a lot of us aren't consumerists. So how does that happen? Well, it happens because it's not a dynamic by which somebody is trying to change our mind and convince us of the truth of that claim. It happens because we're immersed in rituals, liturgies, that are subtly and covertly and unconsciously suckering me into acting as if stuff could make me happy. You don't think your way to that as a conclusion. You practice your way to it by giving yourself over to the cathedrals of consumerism, by participating in its rites and rituals and liturgies. So in a sense, what I'm inviting you to do is kind of put on a new set of glasses to look at your own kind of cultural immersion, what you give yourself over to, and just start to ask, what are these things that I'm doing to me? Let me try one more example, something that's so banal and close at hand as just a way of trying to make this kind of pop for us a little bit. So this I figured out while watching a beer commercial. So, it's like a really terrible beer called Michelob Ultra, which is just horrible, horrible beer. But this commercial, in 30 seconds, was one of the most powerful pieces of cultural analysis I've ever seen, okay? It goes like this. Oh, and one more proviso is, you know every beer commercial is just brutally sexist, right? Like just terribly, the whole thing is always premised on that. So I'm not a second defending this, I'm just describing it, okay? It's the end of the workday. Bunch of bros come out of the office building. They somehow, I don't picture a bunch of bros carpooling to work, but these guys did. They carpool to work. It's the end of the workday. They come out of the office building. They come up to the curb. It's Buddy's turn to drive home. They come up to the car. It's a really lame car. Nobody wants to get into this car. And so one of them magically just does this. All of a sudden, the car of their dreams is sitting there waiting for them. They get in. They're good to go. Cut scene. Magic. We're on the beach. Don't ask. I don't know who goes to the beach at 5 o'clock, but anyway, they're on the beach. Off in the distance are some young ladies. They're too far away to know whether they would be interested in them and whether they would be interested in the guys. But you know, who knows what the possibilities are? What can we do? What can we do? Oh, and somebody simply does this. And all of a sudden, young ladies are right there, and they're drinking Michelob Ultra too. Who knew? And everybody's into each other. It's so copacetic. Brilliant. Cut scene, last time. Now we're in the club. DJ's up on the stage playing some really, really lame music. Nobody wants to listen to this music. Don't worry. I got this. Somebody playing exactly what everybody wants to hear. The party's lit, all right? So you see, now what I want you to recognize is you all recognize those little rituals. The little micro ritual, of course, is the ritual of this little desire machine that we call our smartphones. And what I started to realize in watching this Michelob Ultra commercial of all things is it's actually a brilliant analysis of why micro rituals in our lives can start to have macro implications. Because do you see what's actually happening in this commercial is all of the little micro rituals that I give myself over to in my interaction with this little machine are now being projected as my way of relating to the world as a whole. And so now, all of a sudden, I see that the very way that I'm hunched over and involved with this little device and the rituals and liturgies it invites me to, it's tacitly and subtly training me that I'm the center of the universe, and the world should be available to me on my terms, when I want it, how I want it. I should never have to be bored. I should never have to talk to somebody I don't want to. Everything should be available to me on my terms because I am what matters. And you realize, if I asked you, are you an egoist? 99.4% of you are going to say no. That doesn't mean that we aren't giving ourselves over to liturgies that are tacitly training us to be egoists and to imagine that we are the center of the world and that the world should come to us on our terms. You see, what I want us to realize is we are all devoting ourselves to things. We are all giving ourselves over to things, and we have to ask ourselves, what am I giving myself over to, and what is it doing to me? What are the liturgies in your life? Now, David Foster Wallace, as I said, he says that we have a choice of what to worship. We have a choice of what to love, of what to devote ourselves to. But you see, so many of the liturgies of our culture are actually bent on distracting us from this choice so that I default to loving me and loving stuff. And I think we need to appreciate that the dynamics of distraction are actually the dynamics that avoid choice and that keep propelling us into these defaults. And here's again, so this is like an advertisement for why you should all take philosophy, because here's another philosopher from the 1600s who has, I think, some of the most prescient insight into 21st century North America. His name is Blaise Pascal. He was also a great mathematician. And what Pascal pointed out in his work called the Pensées is that we actually like to distract and entertain ourselves rather than face the question, what do I love? I don't want to face that question. I don't want to ask that question. And so what happens is I give myself over to all kinds of distracting practices precisely so I don't have to face that question. In fact, Pascal famously said that humanity's unhappiness springs from one thing alone: our incapacity to stay quietly in one room. Our incapacity, and you imagine, how much was there to distract you in the 17th century, right? And now, our incapacity to sit quietly in a room for 5 seconds, the incapacity to sit at a stoplight when your phone is right there. It's an incredible power to be distracted because, interestingly, all of those distractions and diversions protect us from boredom. And Pascal says that boredom is actually a kind of gateway to the existential. Because you start getting bored, and all of a sudden you start asking yourself, what am I doing? What do I want? What do I love? We want our frantic pursuit. We want our exhausting distraction, precisely because it keeps us from facing the uncomfortable questions. Pascal puts it, we prefer the hunt to the kill. We want the chase. We want the gamble of the casino or the market. We don't actually want to win the money, because we want to distract ourselves from the anxiety and inquietude that characterize our lives. Our society, friends, we all inhabit a society that offers us a myriad of liturgies to help you love distraction rather than reflection. So, if and when something punches through that self-medication of distraction, it might be tragedy or heartbreak. It might be a friend who seems to pierce your soul. It might be a grandma who just will not stop pestering you or let you off the hook. Or it might be a kind of dark malaise that settles unexpectedly on a Saturday night where you're at a party and you're in the middle of this packed room, but you feel entirely alone. And everyone around you kind of fades into this unfocused haze, and time seems to slow down to a standstill. And in this weird fog, you suddenly become aware of how really unhappy you are, and how stupid this is, and how exhausting it is to play this game. And this needling question bubbles up for you right there, and it says, what do you want? Friends, ask that question. Let that question interrogate you. David Foster Wallace, in that same address, frames it this way. An outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, be it JC or Allah, be it Yahweh or the Wiccan Mother Goddess or the Four Noble Truths or some infrangible set of ethical principles, the reason to choose something like that is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally plant you. On one level, we all know this stuff already. It's codified, he says, in myths and proverbs and cliches and bromides and epigrams and parables. It's the skeleton of every great story. The trick, he says, is keeping the truth up front in daily consciousness. Worship power, and you will always feel weak and afraid. You will need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being as smart, seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. See, friends, the real question we have to ask ourselves is, are these things satisfying that hunger? If I'm constantly giving myself over to these liturgies, these cultural rituals that train my heart to love myself and stuff, then the question I'm ultimately going to have to face is, am I enough for myself? Does stuff really satisfy that hunger? See, even devotion to good things can eat us alive. So we can end up actually being frantic activists in a way that's really also trying to squelch some deeper hunger in our soul. So if I'm honest with myself, does sex or pleasure or power or domination or even service and activism and politics, are those really leaving me feeling content? The North African bishop St. Augustine in the 5th century put it this way. He's speaking of God, and he says, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." This claim, I think, forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. What if the love that makes us happy, content, and fulfilled isn't up to us? If I'm faced with the choice of what to love, what to worship, what if there's a right choice? Now, I'm going to put my cards on the table here. I'm not just making a vague appeal for religion as some alternative to these cultural liturgies. Unlike David Foster Wallace, I think it actually makes a difference which God you would choose to worship. But here's how I want to frame the question. If everybody's got a hungry heart, if we are bent on giving ourselves over to something, to someone, then the question I need to ask is, will they satisfy my longings? What is this God going to ask of me? Is this a God who is going to eat me alive, but never set a table? Here's why I'm a Christian. This isn't a proof, it's a testimony. It's framing this, though, in terms of this kind of human hunger. The reason I'm a Christian is because in Christianity, we give ourselves over to a God who gave himself. A God who doesn't just demand or command, but who actually sacrifices himself. You see, the God of Jesus Christ isn't a God who demands our sacrifices in order for us to pay for the evil and brokenness of the world. To the contrary, in Jesus Christ, God gives himself to take on the evil and brokenness of the world. So I know that when I give myself over to Jesus Christ, it's not just another jealous God like money or popularity or prestige that demands my submission, who demands that I worship at his altar, cowering in the hopes that maybe this will pay off. No. I come to the altar of Jesus Christ, and he gives himself. He says, "This is my body given for you." And interestingly, I know you might not get this listening to the pundits and talking heads on the news today who call themselves Christian. But what I would wish for you, if you don't know Christianity or if you have perceptions of Christianity, what I wish you would know is that actually Christians are a people who every single week gather to confess that we don't love what we say we do. That is honest about all of the ways that we fail to love what we think. The liturgy of confession is at the heart of this, not because we're sort of into some kind of spiritual sadomasochism, because it's actually the grace to name that gap in our lives. You see, grace is at the very heart of Christianity because this God is a giver all the way down. So, if Christianity were true, okay, if someone like Augustine were right, and I'm not pretending to prove this to you, I'm saying try this on as an account of why someone might entertain Christianity. If Christianity is true, then that actually might do some work explaining two phenomena that I think we keep running into in our secular age, and it might even explain something that you've bumped up against yourself. The first is this. If Christianity were true, if God is transcendent and offers himself to us in Jesus Christ, then it would actually help explain why our attempts to find rest and peace and contentment and fulfillment in a wide array of substitutes is so often frustrating, exhausting, and disappointing. It would actually explain why, when we frenetically chase and try out all kinds of other things to love, that they never quite seem to work. It would actually go a long ways to explaining a lot of our own frustration. But secondly, I wonder if it might also help explain why some of us still feel haunted. I wonder if it might help explain that behind these attempts to find ultimacy in things or experiences, we keep hearing this echo of something, of someone who keeps whispering an alternative. Maybe that would explain why we can't quite shake that. This dual experience of frustration and haunting, I think, is beautifully captured in one of my favorite poems, and I hope you'll indulge me and let me read this in closing. It's a poem called Staying Power by Jeanne Murray Walker, poet at the University of Delaware. And there's an epigraph to the poem that says this: in appreciation of Maxim Gorky at the International Convention of Atheists, 1929. The poem is called Staying Power. Like Gorky, I sometimes follow my doubts outside to the yard and question the sky, longing to have the fight settled, thinking I can't go on like this. And finally I say, all right, it is improbable, all right, there is no God. And then, as if I'm focusing a magnifying glass on dry leaves, God blazes up. It's the attention, maybe, to what isn't there that makes the emptiness flare like a forest fire until I have to spend the afternoon dragging the hose to put the smoldering thing out. Even on an ordinary day, when a friend calls, tells me they've found melanoma, complains that the hospital is cold, I say, God, I say as my heart turns inside out. Pick up any language by the scruff of its neck, wipe its face, and set it down on the lawn. I bet it will toddle right into the God fire again, which, though they say it doesn't exist, can send you straight to the burn unit. Oh, we have only so many words to think with. So say God's not fire. Say anything. Say God's a phone, maybe. You know you didn't order a phone, but there it is. It rings. You don't know who it could be. You don't want to talk, so you pull out the plug. It rings. You smash it with a hammer till it bleeds, springs, and coils and clobbery metal bits. It rings again. You pick it up, and a voice you love whispers, "Hello." Friends, what do you want? What do you long for? Could it be that in all our pursuits we're actually hoping for someone like that to say hello? What if you've been distracting yourself to try to ignore that ringing? What if you picked it up? What have you got to lose? What might you find? Might you be found? Thank you.
So we now have some time for questions to be directed to our speaker. There are microphones in the aisles where you can line up and wait for your turn to ask a question. Please make sure that you are asking a question and not making a comment, and keep your question brief and to the point. We also ask that you wait for Dr. Smith to recognize you at the microphone before asking your question.
Thank you. Great. Yes, ma'am.
Hi there. Thank you for your talk. My name is Jasmine. I have a quick question. So the main theme of your talk was about this idea of humans being unsatisfied in some way, and we're searching for fulfillment or contentment or something through the pursuit of multiple things, maybe through entertainment, distraction, we're searching. But one thing you didn't talk about that I was hoping you could maybe talk a little bit about, what does it mean to be satisfied or fulfilled or contented?
Sorry, could you say that one more time?
What does it mean, or what does it mean to be satisfied or contented, or what does that look like?
It's a great question. The question is, what if we're trying to give an analysis of our dissatisfactions, what would satisfaction look like? It's a great question. I think it doesn't look like having it all. Do you know what I mean? It's not, interestingly, satisfaction, contentment here is not actually because you've acquired all of the things you were chasing. It's more like because some other kind of fundamental significance and question has been settled for you, that you can kind of live with open hands and you don't have to be grasping everything. So interestingly, so I'm almost everything I think I have stolen from St. Augustine, who I mentioned earlier, so he's kind of my homeboy. And interestingly, whenever Augustine wants to talk about, he doesn't use satisfaction language, he uses peace and joy. And I wonder, maybe those have different connotations for us that do a little bit more work, which is, and by the way, joy is not the same as a constant state of emotional perkiness and happiness. It's this kind of seated, it's a lack of anxiety, right? It's peace. It doesn't mean everything's going well. It means that I have this kind of stability in who I am resting, so that I'm not frantic and anxious. And I don't know, I think, so that maybe the opposite, satisfaction is the opposite of angst and frantic anxiousness. So maybe joy, peace, rest. Interestingly, Augustine also uses the metaphor of rest, which might speak to that. That's a great question. It's not an adequate answer, but might be a start. Thank you. And what I'll do is I'll sort of bounce back and, well, except this is a loaded one. Let me go here and then we'll come back over here. Or you're just manning the mic, Bob.
It's the bouncer.
Great, okay. Next.
Does this work? Okay. What about those who
Thank you.
who believe they're already at peace or joy wherever they already are?
Yeah. Here, interestingly, to be like really perfectly honest, if that's the state or situation in which you find yourself, I can't sort of pry you out of that. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's interesting. I'm not going to try to argue of that. I will say this, and this is just because of, granted, religious and theological commitments I have as a philosopher. I think my expectation is that any confidence in peace, rest, satisfaction, and contentment that is dependent upon things that are finite is too unstable and contingent and temperamental to probably sustain that over time. So that I'm not going to try to push you into your dissatisfaction. Instead, I'm going to keep walking alongside you, and I want to be there if that starts to not work for you anymore, and then we would have the conversation at that point, if that sounds fair. Yeah. Great.
Hi. Earlier you were talking about how basically everything we do is not voluntary. So I guess I just
almost everything. Yeah.
I just kind of like to know what you mean by not voluntary, and I guess with the way I see it, not voluntary, like, why should we even care about what we do that's not voluntary?
So, okay, this is a great question, and if I am understanding you correctly, there's a really interesting philosophical issue here, which is, I'm saying, interestingly, I don't know if I use the language of not voluntary. I might have. What I would say is it's not deliberative, it's not consciously chosen, it's governed by acquired habits and dispositions. Here's the thing, I still think we are responsible for our habitual dispositions. So, interestingly, I've just been doing, there's some really interesting work happening right now on philosophy of race and critical race theory. And I think one of the most powerful accounts, by the way, of racism is not if you just think of it as a conscious ideology, but actually as habitual dispositions. But obviously then, if you're going to account for racism as a set of acquired, learned, habitual dispositions, that doesn't mean that you're not responsible for it, right? It's just that now you need a different account of how that's gotten hold of you. And what unlearning it looks like is not just changing your mind, it's actually a process of rehabituation. So part of why I think it's helpful to live an examined life, to realize how much of my life is sort of governed by pre-conscious habits I've learned, is it's kind of a wake-up call for me to learn to start to be more intentional about what I'm giving myself over to, right? I don't think I can ever live without those habits, but maybe I need to be conscious and intentional about choosing new practices that are going to birth in me different habits. Does that make sense?
So basically you're saying that with these, I guess not involuntary, but what you're going to decide is foregone conclusions is like what you're
Yeah,
saying?
although interesting, to put it that way, you're kicking back up into the intellectual register as if these are things that we are thinking about, whereas what I'm saying is, what I mean is something like this. For the most part, when you get up in a day and then you sort of move through your day and then move through the course of a life, you are, in some ways, there's like a vision of the good life that has tacitly and inchoately and covertly kind of captured your imagination on this unconscious level. And a lot of what you do in your life is like the magnetic pull of those habits towards this. It's not because you wake up and say, today I'm going to choose wealth to make me happy. It's more like you default into a bunch of patterns that then propel you in that direction. Yeah, great question. Sir.
First off, thank you. As Christians, we believe that Jesus is the one true path to happiness and fulfillment in this life. Yet on campus, we every day come across those who say that they are already happy or have found fulfillment in any other way, shape, or form, be it be another lifestyle choice or another religion of their own. So my question to you is, how would you recommend we evangelize to those who say they have already been spiritually enlightened or found fulfillment in other forms other than Christ?
So, to be perfectly honest, I don't know if this will thrill you, but so I honestly don't know. I have to confess, and maybe this is just my sort of philosophical inclinations. I kind of want to sit down and listen in that conversation, because that really intrigues me. Do you know what I mean? To imagine this sort of fullness of a life that, to me, like for example, if I believe that human beings are created by a God to have a relationship with that God as the kind of core feature of flourishing, then those who believe that they have found carved out ways of life that can do that without referring to transcendence or the divine, for me, the first stage of that conversation is to listen and to understand what significance, happiness, contentment means for them. What I'm probably not so interested in doing, and maybe you even get that tonight, is I'm not interested in like kind of picking a fight intellectually. Not because I don't think that Christianity doesn't have truth, but because I actually don't think that that's really meeting people where they are on the register of their kind of deepest longings. So I think there's a lot, Christians have a lot to learn from hearing why people see these as valuable ways of life, right? Now, the other thing that's interesting is, and this would probably be a short conversation because they would start going, and they wouldn't care. But what's interesting is how many of the features of what we take for granted as a kind of typical, happy, late modern, capitalist kind of life Interestingly, I guess I might want to have a conversation with them about how much that way of life owes debts to the Christian tradition that they don't realize. The ways in which the features of a society that we take for granted today as a condition for happiness owe debts to the Christian tradition, and maybe that would be the beginning of a conversation. Yeah. I'm not necessarily in your context as much, right? So I'm sure I have a lot to learn about that too. Thank you. Great.
Hi. So you say that the majority of our choices in our lives are like habitualized, I guess, and you say that it's all subconscious. And I thought that was really interesting. So I thought it would be pretty reasonable that like a lot of the things in our lives that we find dissatisfying or that we're unsatisfied with are also a result of like perhaps unconscious habitualizations. So
Yes.
would you have any input on how people could dehabitualize these things or like work themselves out of these patterns?
Yeah. I mean, here's one thing that's really interesting. So I kept mentioning David Foster Wallace. I'm also a total David Foster Wallace fanboy. And what he will, and his novels actually get at this. Okay, I'm gonna come back to that in a sec. So you can only dehabituate by rehabituating, right? In other words, the sort of solution, if you will, the transformation isn't just cognitive and deliberative either. You can't think your way out of bad habit formation. Right? Even tonight's talk, in which we are all thinking about these things, would never be adequate to actually get you out of certain habitual formations. What you need to do is give yourself over to other rhythms, habits, liturgies, practices, communities, repertoires of practice, which are then going to start to inscribe new habits and new orientations in you. I'll give you, the reason I mentioned Wallace is, in Wallace's work, addiction recovery centers are always little microcosmic examples of this, because anybody who knows anything about AA is you don't go to an AA meeting to learn some information to help you recover. The point isn't intellectual, it's in the going. It's the ritual that is, and it's the practice that helps you practice your way out of it. So I think if you took like a totally trivial example of that, right? If you imagine certain habits and inclinations that this thing has sucked or put in me because it keeps sucking my attention. Again, this is a totally trivial example, but in a way, I would start to rehabituate myself when I simply just turn off every notification on my phone. Do you see how that's, now what has happened is I've changed the environmental conditions in which I live so that now it's going to propel different sorts of habits of attention, something like that.
Thank you.
You think? Great. Yes?
What are one or two practical practices we could use as a takeaway tonight, maybe to start focusing our hearts more around Christ?
Yes. So I'm a philosopher, so I don't do practical. But yeah. Okay, so here's my honest answer to that, and then I feel like it's going to be a lame answer. Here's my honest answer. So I think anybody who is interested in Christianity should, instead of trying to settle it as an intellectual question first, should give themselves over to the practices of the body of Christ as a place to try it on believing. So for me, if you ask me what I think are the most central practices for sort of refocusing our heart habits, it's actually the practices of gathered congregations in worship and around word and table, as we put it, the preached word and the sacraments, because those are actually a repertoire of practices to which the Spirit has made a promise that they would be formative. And I would just say, if anybody is at all curious about Christianity, instead of just treating it as a set of intellectual ideas that now you're going to go assess, I would really encourage you to consider going to a congregation where you could actually try on the practices of what it feels like to believe. And you can sort of, it's kind of like a test drive. But in a way, what that means then is these things are coming bottom up rather than just top down. So a lot of it, now, for those who might already be Christians, I think another sort of repertoire here is the sorts of spiritual disciplines that, say, a Dallas Willard talks about. So disciplines of prayer and fasting and hospitality, right? These are all ways of sort of practicing our way into the kingdom rather than just thinking our way into it. Yeah, that's not an adequate answer, but might be a start.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes?
In what ways has a postmodernist epistemology directed people towards looking for meaning in the wrong areas? And how as Christians do we resist these influences living in the society we do?
You said epistemology and my heart is strangely warmed. So actually, interesting, this would be a much longer conversation in which you and I would have to come to an agreement about what we think is called a postmodern epistemology. I'll put my cards on the table, which is this. I actually think a lot of the postmodern critique of modernist epistemology, Enlightenment models of knowing, are actually an ally of the kind of project that I'm undertaking here, because they actually help to relativize the narrowly cognitivist picture of the human person. See, what I saw emerging from modernity is this kind of Cartesian thinking thingism, the brain on a stick picture of the human person. And I think if we just accept that kind of rationalist model of the human person, that's exactly when we miss the significance of the power of habit and the affections in who we are as human. So I saw the postmodern critique of that as actually opening us up to a new holism in our appreciation of the human person.
So both Christians and postmodernists would have critiques of modernism,
Yeah.
or postmodernists would just have critiques for the wrong reasons, or be looking at it a different way?
Not just the wrong reason. Maybe we could just put it this way. Christians and certain postmodern theorists would actually be allies in a certain critique of modernity and the Enlightenment, even if they ultimately diverge, obviously, on some other fundamental. I'm not saying Michel Foucault is a Christian, right? But there's a sense in which we actually have an alliance in an interest in how, one of the things we inherited from modernity was this stunted, reductionistic, top-heavy, bobblehead picture of human beings as if they were just thinking things. And that's exactly why we miss the power of habit in our lives, which is then why we miss how all of these cultural practices are deforming us in the process. Yeah. So that, and then there'd be a next stage of the conversation where the critique would go back and forth. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi. Thank you for coming. So correct me if I'm wrong. You said that we should put our faith in God because, as opposed to putting our faith in things like stuff or ourselves, when we put our faith in God, we put our faith in a God that instead of consuming us, was consumed for us, right?
Yeah. That's what I'm suggesting. At least that's what I see as quite distinctive to Christianity's understanding of God.
So then, let's say hypothetically, I were to find a God that was that also sacrificed himself, like the flying spaghetti monster, right? Let's say I believe he died for my sins too.
Okay.
Then why should I believe Christianity as opposed to the flying spaghetti monster? I guess the core of my question is, what about the truth of Christianity?
Yeah. So then we would move to a different, because then what I would say is, it'd be, first of all, there'd be historical arguments that we could have. So I would say, please take me to your leader. And you'd be like, well, I'm the only one who believes this. I'd be like, oh, well, so you just made this up, didn't you? Right? Okay. Whereas you come to me and I'll say, well, here's the thing. I'm going to show you people around the entire globe who for 2,000 years have gathered every single Sunday and had this meal that Jesus gave them. So I think there's a lot of really, there's quite a weight of historical burden in my favor as opposed to your I forget what you called it, but so it would be partly that. It'd be partly about, now I have not in this context, because I wasn't doing sort of straight up apologetics, but we would have to talk about the resurrection of the dead, right? And then historical testimony for that and so on. So I think we could have that conversation, and I have a fair bit of confidence that I can sort of bring the heat to the table, but I don't want to, at the end of the day, I will say, I'm not sure that what would prevent you from sitting down at that table where Jesus invites you to the supper is probably not arguments. It's probably going to be something else, but I want to be intellectually responsible about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. That's a fun question. I like that. You have to keep in mind, in philosophers, we have an argument called the Great Pumpkin Argument. So we do this kind of stuff all the time.
So this is kind of actually a lot sillier than everybody else's questions, but did they ever go into the room, and if they did, is that like...
No, I'm not telling you. You have to watch it.
Is that like, well, I mean like...
The whole thing is on YouTube. You can watch for free. I will say it is not exactly like the Room of Requirements in Harry Potter, okay? So I don't want to spoil it for you.
But would the potential ending of the movie, would that be related to our relationship with Jesus and the fulfillment we would get from that?
The only thing I also want to say is, look, I think part of honestly being a Christian is to say this. I'm not entirely sure I want to step into that room either. Now, fortunately, my being a Christian doesn't depend upon how well I have mastered my own desires. It's grace. I'm forgiven. But I also think it is actually part of Christianity to be realists about the extent of our own continuing deformations. Does that sound? And that's exactly why, as I pointed out, confession is actually an integral part of what Christians do when they gather, is to sort of own that, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello. Thank you. Okay, so the man comes to this room that he hungers. And let's say the person at the door opens the door for this person.
Yeah.
After a few knocks.
Yeah.
He's knocking, finally opens the door, and greets the person who opens the door and wants to come in this room that he hungers. But the person closes the door in this person's face. Now, I will ask you, does this mean that this man doesn't truly desire this room, but he's forcing himself to believe that he desires it?
I guess I'd have to know who's opening and closing the door in this scenario.
The person that he thinks he desires.
The person that thinks, sorry?
So the person coming to the door, the person who's at the door,
yeah,
that's the person who the hungry person desires in the room.
And then that's the person who shuts the door on him?
Correct.
I'm having a little, and the question is whether that means that's not what he really desires?
That's not what he truly, does that mean that's not what he truly desires? Because if he truly desired it, he'd find a way to get in.
I think you have to ask Tarkovsky. I'm not sure. Or it sounds like you've got another movie idea. Yeah, I'm not sure what the parameters of this world are here.
Desire.
Right? Yeah, no,
so
I get.
This is the desire.
So, I just need to know something about the character of this person who's shutting the door, I guess. Yeah.
I would say it's, let's say it can be any type of desire. It could be a desire for riches. It could be a desire for a mate.
Oh, and desire itself is shutting the door?
The actual desire itself is shutting the door. So it could be, let's say it's a mate. Let's say it's the opposite sex. And that's what's shutting the door. So maybe that's not what that person is. So I'm asking you, maybe that person, whatever he's hungering, like you're saying, because he's being conditioned from his habits, or he's acting, so maybe he doesn't truly desire that. So that's my question.
Yeah. I will have to think about that. I don't have a good answer to that question.
Well, wait. I mean, no.
You stop.
All
You stop.
right.
That's great. Thank you. That's great. Here.
Hi, Dr. Smith. My name is Andrew, and I want to first thank you for coming and
my pleasure,
giving the speech. And so I have a question and regarding a other theologian / public speaker that that I really respect and greatly revere. So it's Dr. Frank Turek, and in his book called "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist," he mentioned how in multiple places he spoke at, he would ask those who claim to be atheists the question, if Christianity was true, would you believe in it? And oftentimes their answer is no. Now, I have a biblical explanation for it, with the biblical perspective, because of the total depravity of mankind. We have, we just naturally want to turn 180 degrees from God, and even though the solution is presented there, we don't take it. But I don't know how you would, like, let's say today I want to evangelize to someone who is, who has no biblical background, no knowledge about Christianity in general. How do I argue that from a philosophical point of view?
Yeah, so interesting, and I don't know, again, I suspect this will not please you, but so you'll notice that in a way, and again, you can be frustrated with me about this. What I would say is going on there is no argument is at issue there, because it's not a cognitive deliberative problem, actually. It's an affective problem, right? So if somebody says, I don't care if it's true, I don't want it, you're not going to change people's wants with better arguments. So I think a lot of what is sort of misguided about Christian apologetics approaches is that they basically imagine what would be the hammer-nail analogy here? Not every question or reticence is an intellectual problem that can be solved with a better syllogism. Do you know what I mean? There's other dynamics that are going on here. It's exactly why I actually think inviting people to try on the practices of being a people who believe can often do more work at this affective level than trying to find what is just the right premise hammer that I can hit this conclusion nail with. And the sort of apologetics approach tends to assume that everybody is a thinking thing, is a brain on a stick, and now I just got to figure out what's the way into the brain. Whereas I'm saying, look, we are whole persons, and there's all kinds of affective, I don't know why all of a sudden I'm waving at my arm, but there's all kinds of affective dynamics going on there, and you can't think your way out of it, and you can't think your way into it either. And that's frustrating, because we think, but wait, I've got all these arguments, and they're valid, and they're true. I'm like, that's fantastic, bro. Nobody wants, in some ways, the existential hurdle here is not whether or not somebody can process the syllogism. And that's why I think you have to think of what invitation looks like. Invitation looks different than argumentative domination in that sense. Yeah. I don't know, but you guys, again, you might have more experience of this on a certain front line than I do. That's just my pot.
I think you answered the question really well.
Okay.
So thank you.
Great, thank you. One last question. Yep. Here.
Thank you, sir, and thank you, sir, for coming. Actually, I happen to be in a position to answer that last question real quick. Even if Christianity were shown to be true, I would say that no, I wouldn't worship a God who threatens to torture me for eternity. Anyways, on to my question. Yeah. You asked us repeatedly tonight, what do you want?
Yeah.
What do you want? And I can honestly tell you, and I'm laying all my cards on the table, that I want God to talk with me. I want to speak with him. I want to speak with God. Actually speak with him, as in, like I'm speaking with you.
You want to hear the voice.
I want to hear his voice.
Yes.
And I've been seeking him for 20 years, and he adamantly refuses to do so, apparently. And I can tell you the reason I don't believe is not because of intellectual arguments, as you have mentioned. It's not intellectual, it's emotional. Yeah. It's because I've been promised a God who loves me, who utterly refuses to speak with me. I want to know why won't God speak? Because if he spoke, you'd be out of a job, to be honest with you.
Yeah, right, right.
We wouldn't need you. We wouldn't need Alvin Plantinga. We wouldn't need William Lane Craig.
Yes.
If God wanted people to know he was real, all he has to do is show up. So why doesn't he?
Yep. So there's something, thank you very much for sharing that. I really appreciate that. And I can empathize. And you might be surprised how many days Christians spend wishing they could have that same thing. There's something going on in the kind of risk God takes, that he's also a God who hides. And it's not because he's playing hide and seek, but because there is something about, not the veil, but there is something about almost the humility of God, of how God makes his way to us. I think the fundamental movement of the Christian God is actually a movement of humiliation and condescending down and taking on the evil of the world, a human form, all of these kinds of things. And so in a way, it's almost like he honors our freedom and he honors our quests by coming to us in ways that are humble and not written in the sky. I think it's also, though, partly because he wants us to meet us in his Son, and then meet us in, and this is really scandalous, meet us in the people who have met his Son. So that there is something inherently communal in the testimony to Christianity, which means, granted, I'd be the first to admit that Christians are not the best testimony for Christ, and yet the scandal is there will be seasons in which it might be just the 3 little old ladies from the Lutheran church down the street who show up as the hands and feet of Jesus just when you need to hear that voice. And I grant, I want more than that sometimes too, and yet there is something about coming through that and then realizing that God has given us this word that speaks to us from Scripture in so many polyvalent ways that I hear things that I could never hear just in a direct voice. Again, that's not adequate. I'm not going to pretend to convince you. It's just a testimony of somebody who's not unfamiliar, I think, with what you're asking for. Yeah. Thank you again for sharing that. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Please.
Thanks.